Let me just, first of all, get a little clear on definitions. I think you and I both, when we speak of consciousness, are just talking about subjective experience in a broad sense. I mean, some people define consciousness in a way that's inherently specific to the human species. It's like self-awareness or something. But this is just the fact that, like, when my dog wags its tail, I think it's feeling something. Or when it seems that it's been injured, I think it's feeling pain. So it's something that any animal could in principle feel. We don't know for sure, but it's just kind of the fact that it's like to be something to be alive, as Thomas Nagel put it, right?
Yeah, basically, it's like something to be me. It's like something to feel pain or to see the color red. These all have an associated quality of subjective experience and needn't be anything terribly complicated. Any system which is actually feeling pain will be conscious in this sense. You're conscious if it feels like something from the inside. I mean, Tom Nagel talked about what is it like to be a bat? Well, we don't know, but as long as it's like something to be a bat, then the bat is conscious. Philosophers sometimes talk about phenomenal consciousness, just to it's a technical term that just means it kind of appears like something to you, to kind of capture the distinctive sense of consciousness and to distinguish it from self-consciousness, consciousness of yourself, which is probably something a lot more complicated, limited to humans and perhaps a few other species, and other kinds of, behaviorally defined consciousness. What matters for the kind of consciousness we're talking about today is just the experience.
Mm-hmm. My own wacky theory may get us into the subject of self-consciousness, but we'll come to that later. Now, if people were to ask, well, why is it a mystery what consciousness is for? I guess we should say that on some views of consciousness, it's not so mysterious. So like if you look at the way Descartes looked at consciousness, that's called interactive dualism, meaning, dualistic in the sense that this consciousness is in some sense separate from the body. And the interactive part means that, on the one hand, the body influences consciousness, but on the other hand, according to Descartes, consciousness influences the body. That's the interaction. It goes both ways. And if that's the case, it's no great mystery. Then consciousness is integral to the functioning of the body. It's there to help the body work, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, to even pose the question, what is consciousness for, it helps to talk a little about a prior question, which is how can we explain why why does consciousness exist at all? And can we, for example, explain it in terms of processes in the brain? You might think, okay, well, we can explain everything about the mind straightforwardly in terms of the brain, so why not consciousness too? The trouble is, well, that works pretty well for aspects of the mind which are tied very deeply to behavior, to doing stuff, to responding, to use of language, and so on. It's very unclear how that works for explaining subjective experience itself. It seems that you could explain all the stuff that I do, how I, for example, walk around, how I respond to your questions, and it still seems a bit of a mystery why all of that should be accompanied by a first-person perspective, something that feels like something from the inside when I'm experiencing this conversation. So various people, including me, have argued there's in fact a principled limitation there, and you're not going to explain everything about consciousness in terms of processes in the brain. And, I've at least entertained the idea that it's something non-physical, but that raises the question of what it is that consciousness does, all the more strongly. How could something non-physical play a role in the physical world? Descartes thought consciousness was non-physical, but he actually gave it a role in the physical world, saying there's a non-physical consciousness affects your brain via the pineal gland, and that goes on to affect behavior. And in fact, consciousness might be directly causally responsible for things like our use of language and our sophisticated reasoning.
As preface, let's get back to, first of all, panpsychism, the view you subscribe to, and the view that, again, you hear more and more about, it seems. But you distinguish between two kinds of panpsychism, a kind of a weak form and a kind of a strong form, and I think you subscribe to the strong form. And then, in fact, there's a stronger form of the strong form, but we'll get to that. The generic description again is that, and I'm reading really from your own writing, is that panpsychism is the view that mind or consciousness is present in all of reality. That's literally pan, meaning, all, and psyche, meaning, mind or consciousness. Now, what you call a weaker form is, I think, basically the only form I had heard about. And it's, I think, the more commonly expressed. And you quote the Oxford English Dictionary saying that it's the view that there is an element of consciousness in all matter. So it's almost like, there's an interior to all matter, or something. There's a kind of a subjective interior or a subjective side you don't see to all matter. That's the version of panpsychism I have most often heard. And is it, do you think, the most commonly expressed form?
These days, I'm not sure. Would it be okay if I took a step back?
Sure.
Here? It's just that a question that arises when you encounter the views of people like Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish is, why are they saying this? What is motivating them to deny something that seems obviously to exist? And the answer is because they define themselves as materialists or physicalists. And they think that if you think that everything is physical, you cannot think that there is phenomenal qualitative consciousness. So that's meant to be the kind of twist in my saying I'm a physicalist. I'm saying I agree with you, Dan and Keith, that everything is physical, but I don't think that rules out the reality of consciousness. And then there's one more move. I'm sorry this is a big step back, which is to say, please don't think that physics gives us any reason to think that consciousness isn't as real as we ordinarily take it to be, because physics is just a matter of equations and it doesn't tell us about the ultimate intrinsic nature of matter. It leaves that open. So the way is open for being an outright realist about consciousness and a physicalist. So I reject their very starting point, which is commitment to physicalism and the belief that that gives them reason to be somehow less than realist about consciousness. That's the sort of dialectic of it all.
I mean, I do appreciate the challenge they may see in reconciling what we think of as physicalism or materialism with a belief, that consciousness is real, because, I mean, if consciousness, I mean, it is a noun, consciousness. So if you think of it as a kind of a stuff,
oh no.
Well,
yeah.
It's not physical stuff, apparently. So, well, I mean, I know you may disagree, but I mean, the intuitive notion would certainly be that, like, my consciousness, if we're going to use it, as a noun like that, if it refers to a kind of stuff, the common intuition would be, well, that it's not a physical stuff. Now, it may be totally determined by the physical stuff in your brain. It may entirely correlate with the physical movements in your brain, but the consciousness per se, I mean, you can see the appeal of the idea that the consciousness per se is not physical, right?
I can, but I'd say it was a mistake. Here the problem is that the word physical is getting used in two ways. One of them ties the word physical closely to the kind of thing that physics tells us about. And the other just uses it as a word for whatever is out there, whatever its nature. And if you want to find people who define themselves as physicalists and think that consciousness is wholly physical, look at some of the great physicists of the last century, like sort of Heisenberg and Schrödinger and probably Einstein, although don't quote me on that, and perhaps Planck also, certainly Whitehead, and all those people thought that everything was physical, but they thought that physics, the theory of physics, simply didn't have anything to say about the ultimate intrinsic nature of things. So that left room for them to say that consciousness too is physical, although of course it isn't like a stone that you kick. Or
So physics tells us how to manipulate the fundamental stuff of reality. It doesn't tell us what the fundamental stuff of reality is.
Doesn't tell us. It tells us quite a lot of things. It tells us that in my brain there are 8-ish things, that's oxygen, and there are 7-ish things, there are nitrogen atoms. It does lots of stuff with numbers and structures and relations, but it doesn't tell us about the nature of the stuff that it is describing in all those mathematical ways.
Most people think of the physical world as being the fundamental thing, and consciousness, subjective experience, or as you say, mind, and I think you're using mind as roughly synonymous with consciousness?
Correct.
Okay. They see that as something that's associated with part of the material world. I think most people would say that it's with the advent of life, living systems, that you might start getting subjective experience. But the material world is what's fundamental, first of all, temporally. It existed before consciousness existed. That even now, consciousness is only associated with a subset of the material world. And in that sense, it's kind of an add-on. It's something that parts of the material world have. I have consciousness. And you take issue with that. You're saying that, no, it's consciousness that's fundamental. In fact, it's so fundamental that I don't think you'd even say the material world as we normally conceive it is the add-on. You're not just asking us to reverse the relationship, I think, and think of consciousness as fundamental. And then there's also this material world. You're saying the material world as we conceive it is really just not at all the material world as we conceive it. It is only a manifestation of consciousness.
That is correct. Yet there is a lot in the intuition that you were describing. Individual consciousness, individuated consciousness, separate consciousness did arise at some point in the history of the cosmos. It wasn't there from the beginning, and it did arise when life arose. So life is what individuated consciousness looks like. Or to speak a more technical term, life is what dissociated aspects of mind look like when observed from the outside.
So parts of mind that are kind of severed off, like my consciousness is just a part of the universal consciousness that is kind of, it is discrete, it is distinct, and yet there is some kind of continuity with the universal consciousness.
That's correct. So what you lose is what we might call associative inference. What you lose is the ability to link your thoughts and cognitively associate them with something that's happening beyond you, beyond your personal self. So you become cognitively isolated. Now, we know this happens in mind. We know it happens in human minds. Humans can become internally dissociated. It's called dissociative identity disorder in the psychiatric literature. We know that dissociative processes in the brain of a person suffering from dissociative identity disorder look like something identifiable. You can diagnose people with dissociative identity disorder, or DID, by looking at functional MRI or brain scanner images. So those dissociative processes look like something. So the argument is that in the mind of nature, when dissociation happens, the resulting dissociative processes look like something. And what they look like is what we call biology, life, metabolism. But that doesn't mean that before life arose, there was no consciousness. There was consciousness. Consciousness is the only thing that exists. But before the rise of life, there was no dissociated aspect of consciousness.
So was it like something to be the universe before life existed?
I think there has always been something it is like to be the universe, even before life existed. And if you could go back in time to a point before life arose and look at the universe, you would see a material, what we call colloquially a material or physical universe, very similar to what we see today, just more than 4 billion years ago. But if no dissociated aspect of consciousness were looking at it, then the only thing that would be experienced would be the first-person perspective of the universe. In other words, what it is like to be the universe as opposed to what it is like to observe the universe.
Now, is this a variant of panpsychism then? There's something you have in common with panpsychists, but are you a panpsychist? Or, again, so panpsychists think that there is some degree of consciousness or sentience or something associated with every physical thing, every atom, right? Are they, what's the relationship between you and them?
Very little, surprisingly little. Panpsychists acknowledge that physical entities have standalone existence. Idealists think that physical entities are just appearances. They are what mental processes look like when observed from a certain perspective. To speak more technically, when observed from across a dissociative boundary. So physical entities under idealism have no standalone existence. They are just forms of manifestation, appearances, images, extrinsic appearances of something that is inherently mental. Panpsychists acknowledge that physical entities do have standalone existence, and they have fundamental properties like mass, charge, spin. Oh, and in addition, they have the property of being conscious, fundamentally. So all they achieve is to avoid the explanation, because you just say, well, consciousness is fundamental, so I don't need to reduce it. But there is still a physical world that is conscious. While I say that the physical world is in consciousness, not that it is conscious. And there is a tremendous difference here.
You have a website called Tricks of the Mind, on which you say that consciousness is kind of a trick of the mind. And I guess that's relevant to what you're going to tell us about what your view is. How would you characterize your view of consciousness?
I would say that we have a way of thinking about consciousness, which is quite natural to us, at least natural to people within the Western philosophical tradition. I mean, how far it is natural cross-culturally, I'm not sure. And it is the way that Descartes had. There is this inner sound and light show, this technicolor phenomenology, as Colin McGinn puts it, this inner world, which we know with more certainty than anything else, which according to some people is the basis for our knowledge of the external world, and which is deeply, deeply puzzling. So neuroscientists can tell me an awful lot about my brain, about what's going on there, right down to the very detailed level, and increasingly in terms of how the components interact, the larger scale structure, the information processing that's happening there. But they can tell me nothing about this inner sound and light show. It's completely invisible to them. And this is I think, quite a natural conception of consciousness. Even if it's not the one that everybody starts out with, it's one that they can very soon be induced to adopt with a little bit of talking about it. And I think that's an illusion.
Okay.
I think that is this internal world.
Okay, let me be clear. I assume you would agree that even people, you said you're more familiar with the Western conceptions of consciousness, but I assume you'd assume that if you ask someone in Asia, is it like something to be you? Do you feel pain and pleasure? They'd say yes, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So is that an illusion?
We have all kinds of awareness of stuff that's going on in us. I don't deny it. We have awareness of when there's damage to our bodies. We have awareness of our own mental processes. Right. But this is something that can be explained in. This is not the hard problem. The problem of how you can have access to states of your own body, how you could have information about the state of your own body in the way that you can have information about the external world, that isn't really deeply problematic. You just need some kind of internal sensors of some sort.
So in other words, you could build a robot that has, where you take information about its own state and feed it into the robot. But of course, it still would not, we don't know that it would be like anything to be the robot. So, and that's a harder question, right? Like,
that's where you're starting to go down the path of asking this question: is it like something in some sense that goes beyond this kind of internal awareness, this sort of inner sensing? Now, inner sensing, I'm sure Dave Chalmers would say, is one of the easy problems. It's not hard to explain.
Inner sensing in the robotic, mechanical sense of the feedback of physical information, like a physical information flow. Okay.
And awareness of the dispositions and reactions that stimuli cause. So you.
Yeah, I just want to make sure people don't get confused here, because I think a lot of people, when they hear the word awareness, they start thinking about something they're not sure a robot has. They think about subjective experience, and they'd say, no, wait, you can build the physical information feedback loops into the robot, but I still don't know that it has, quote, awareness, because I think of that as being subjective experience. But you're not using the word that way?
Absolutely not. No, I'm using the sense of registering information.
Okay, that's a good one, yeah. Okay.
And the way that as a very simple example, the way that the thermostat does. It registers information about temperature.
Okay.
And then build the thermostat into a larger system. It can use that information to control other things.
Okay.
More complex sensors, more and more complex reactions, more and more complex control systems.
So self-monitoring.
Absolutely. And layers of self-monitoring. Monitoring our own reactions and dispositions. I mean, one thing that, pain, yes. So you stub your toe, you feel pain, right? This is what we say. We feel pain, as if that is some sort of, there's this pure, ineffable sensation that arises in us and that we then react to. But what actually happens, another way of looking at it is you stub your toe and you react in all kinds of ways. You don't like it, you want it to stop, you move. I will use the word feel.
Well, even the word want, people would say, when you said you want it to stop. I mean, you say, you act as if you wanted it to stop is maybe what you...
Well, I have no problem, and I think most cognitive science have no problem with talking about non-conscious desires, non-conscious beliefs, where these are cashed out in functional terms. So a desire, in this sense, is simply some sort of state that has a certain, that is targeted on a certain state of affairs which you're seeking to bring about. So it's a kind of target state of affairs that you want to bring. It's hard to eliminate the folk psychological vocabulary from some of what I'm saying. So it's a target you aim to bring about. That's a desire. So desiring ice cream is having eating ice cream as a target. And then you organize your activity around bringing that target state around, bringing it about. A belief is a registering of information about the world. That, say, there's ice cream in the fridge. So you have that bit of information, you have that desire, you can put them together to develop a plan of how to realize the desire. All of this can be done, it's not implausible to think, without consciousness.
Describe the experience of not self this way. I don't think this is actually classic Buddhist teaching. They're just saying it's the way it feels, which is that they feel that awareness or consciousness is almost just a property of the universe or like a field, and their experience is just a particular point of access to it, kind of. Does that resonate with...
Oh, very much. Yes, it resonates also with the Advaita Vedanta tradition, which I have a lot of sympathy with.
Which is associated with Hinduism.
Yeah, and I think Hinduism is given very bad rep by Buddhists. Always hearing it being put down.
There's a surprising amount of tribalism I've discovered in when I hear some Buddhists talk about Hindu philosophy. Yes.
Yeah, and the Hindus don't tend to do it, but the Buddhists do it. Yes, but though one has to be careful because even where I've read the accounts of arahants in both the Hindu tradition, in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, like Nisargadatta Maharaj and Ramana Maharshi, and also purported arahants in the Buddhist tradition, such as Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Chah, and they all say that one does get to a stage where there's the experiences of a very subtle universal consciousness that's sort of pervading everything. But as I understand it, and this seems to be what they all say, is that you go beyond even that. You go beyond even that to which is just literally indescribable. The best can be said it's an awareness or infinite potentiality, non-manifest, and again, the words are sort of like fingers pointing at the moon. You can't really conceptualize it because the words have been functioned to describe things in the world. But it's even beyond almost beyond a universal consciousness. Again, I'm just going by what they have said, and right. That's who I take to be the authorities on this, rather than scholars. There's the Buddhist suttas and those who have been widely acclaimed as having attained nibbana. Right. So.
And on the one hand, I acknowledge that it sounds kind of new age and woo and wacky to say, well, there's a universal field of consciousness. On the other hand, in my view, consciousness is a sufficiently mystifying problem, which I think some philosophers just literally don't get. And here I will not mention any names like Dan Dennett's, for example. But they just literally don't.
He's explained consciousness.
Oh, I forgot. They just literally don't understand what the problem is. And I think if you do understand what the problem, how profound the problem is, that beings would have this subjective awareness thing, I think you have to be open to the possibility of slightly weird sounding realities being the case. And I don't mean weird, but I mean weird.
Yeah, well, in fact, I mean, to be fair with philosophers, I think they really do feel what they call the hard problem of consciousness, or the explanatory gap, which is just, why is it that a particular neural state feels like that if it is identical? No one would ask, well, why does a particular function of the brain, such as learning, have these particular neural configurations? I mean, it may be difficult to understand, but it's not. There seems to be a sense to it. But when it comes to the hard problem, like why should something feel like this? Why should a particular brain state have a unified kind of conscious field? I mean, philosophers really do. There is a lot of diversion in the different kind of positions, and I think the philosophers really do feel the force of it. Say David Chalmers.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't mean that all of them don't, but I really do think that some philosophers and some non-philosophers who opine on it and write books about it do not understand the problem. But sorry, and I shouldn't be mean.
It is interesting, though, but just on that sort of universal consciousness, it's actually gaining more and more traction, the view of panpsychism in analytical philosophy, the view. So Galen Strawson, for instance, has a very good paper on that idea that even like particles can be conscious. Mm-hmm. I think it's quite a compelling argument, and so it's being taken more and more seriously. So it's not as wacky as one might think, actually.
And this neuroscientist Christoph Koch has I think spoken favorably about panpsychism at times.
I'm not that familiar with his work.
And I think it's not the case that all forms of panpsychism are exactly what we've just described, but it's kind of moving vaguely in that direction. So there is in this a little implicitly some ideas about what consciousness is. I mean, you in the interfaith, you don't take a clear position on the mind-body problem, but you acknowledge at least its difficulty more than some people who call themselves atheists acknowledge. I mean, there's a tendency for atheists to be materialists in a particularly simple-minded way. And to think that we figured out why there is subjective experience, and don't you get it? It's just the brain, and I think a lot of times they really haven't thought about it as much as they might. Now, do you have a position on the mind-body problem, or are you just sure it's a problem?
Well, I'm sure it's a problem, and I'm sure I don't know the answer to it, and I'm reasonably sure all of these people who think they know the answer to it also don't know the answer to it. I mean, I'm close enough to the literature in philosophy and neuroscience.
You won't mention names.
No.
But feel free to. Yes, I'll bet some of them have been on Meaning of Life TV.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think I am somewhat agnostic on this, and actually maybe even agnostic in the true sense, in the sense that I doubt that we're equipped to know ultimately. I think I guess Colin McGinn has really argued for this idea that we just probably are not in a position to resolve this mystery. We may be, but I can't see how. I mean, let's say it is true that consciousness emerges purely out of information processing and in our case, neuronal complexity. You wire together a sufficient number of neurons in the right way, and what was completely unconscious, what had no interior dimension, suddenly lights up, and there's all of a sudden something that it's like to be that brain. Maybe that's true. Let's just stipulate that is in fact a fact. That still seems to me to be the mere declaration of a miracle. I don't understand how that is intelligible to us in the way, and there's many false analogies come rushing in here, like an analogy with heat and and brittleness.
I agree, they're all false.
Yeah.
And it's also not clear why it would be functionally necessary for that to creep into the brain. But this is an argument I've had with Dean Dennett, and it's ultimately, the more you talk about it, the clearer it doesn't get.
Right.
I mean, consciousness is one of those issues on which people who disagree will disagree forever.